This story is based on real events. In the year 1908, in the quiet farmlands of Lincoln County, Nebraska, a tragedy unfolded near an old windmill that would soon divide the town. The name Martha Ellis meant little to most. A 40-year-old African-American woman, a mother of two, the wife of a miller. But within weeks, her name would appear in county records, in testimony books, and in whispers that lasted for years. Her husband was found dead beneath the windmill blades. The coroner called it an unfortunate accident. But when the county sheriff returned to the site days later, he found signs that told another story. What Martha did there, and why, became one of the most debated cases in the Midwest. This is the account of the Windmill Woman of Lincoln County. And by the end of this story, you will know the truth of why she returned, and what she did to stop the wind itself. May 17th, 1908. Sunday morning began quietly in Lincoln County. The air was dry, the fields still half asleep, and the town's few wagons rolled down Main Street toward the chapel. To the west, beyond the last row of houses, the Ellis windmill stood tall above the plains, its wooden blades groaning against the faint morning breeze. William Ellis had risen before dawn, as he always did. For 10 years he had kept that mill running, grinding corn and wheat for nearly every farm in the county. It was old and worn, built before the railroad came through, but it was his livelihood, his pride, and the last thing he could still call his own. By 8 o'clock, the blades had slowed. Around 9, the sound stopped entirely. At 9:30, 12-year-old Samuel Gray ran into the sheriff's office, breathless and pale. He said there was a man hanging from the windmill. Sheriff Walter Caldwell and his deputy saddled up and rode out immediately. When they arrived, the mill stood silent. One of its sails was broken, splintered near the center. The door was open. Inside, William Ellis lay beneath a beam, his body crushed against the mill floor. His hands were stained with oil and his cap lay beside him. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints except his own. The coroner arrived by noon and declared it an accident, a failure of the mill braking mechanism. But Deputy Latham noticed something unusual. The brake lever had not snapped from strain. The brake was clean, straight, as though it had been cut with a saw. That afternoon, Martha Ellis came to the site. She walked from her home alone, a half-mile down the dirt road, and stood before the wreckage. The sheriff told her what had happened. She did not cry. She asked only one question. Did he finish it? Caldwell hesitated, unsure what she meant. Finish what? She looked toward the gears of the mill. The work he started, she said, and then turned away. The following day, the death was recorded in county books as accidental. The Ellis children were sent to stay with relatives. The funeral was held 2 days later in the small cemetery behind St. Joseph's Chapel. Few attended. Martha stood still through the service, her black dress unmoving in the wind. In the days that followed, she spoke to no one. The curtains in her house stayed drawn, and neighbors said they heard her moving through the rooms at night. 3 nights after the funeral, Thomas Gray, the farmer whose son had found the body, claimed he saw someone near the windmill after dark. From his porch, he watched a single lantern bobbing near the structure. He thought it might be vandals. But as he looked closer, he recognized her walk. It was Martha Ellis, carrying a small metal can. He told no one until morning. When he returned to the site after sunrise, smoke was rising from inside the mill. The building hadn't burned, but the machinery was ruined. The air was thick with a sharp chemical smell. Sheriff Caldwell arrived soon after. The gears, grinding stones, and water reservoir had been corroded beyond repair. Acid had eaten through the floorboards and left holes in the soil below. Martha was there, standing beside the door. Her hands were red and blistered. Caldwell asked what she had done. "I was cleansing it," she said. "Cleansing what?" he asked. "The debt." She gave no further explanation. The sheriff ordered her taken into custody while he investigated further. Over the next week, he pieced together the events leading up to William's death. Records at the Lincoln County Bank showed that the mill had been signed over 2 days before the accident. William Ellis had transferred ownership to the bank in exchange for clearing his debts. The mill was no longer his nor Martha's when the accident occurred. The discovery changed everything. The act that had seemed like grief, a widow destroying what reminded her of her husband, now looked deliberate. She had destroyed property that no longer belonged to her. Still, no one in town could say she had ever shown violence or anger. Neighbors described her as quiet, polite, and firm. She rarely spoke in public. Her children were well behaved, her home orderly, her accounts precise. The town divided quickly. Some said she had gone mad from loss. Others believed she knew what she was doing, that the Mill ES destruction was her way of taking back what the bank had taken from her. At the jailhouse, she said nothing more about it. When the pastor came to see her, she told him only, "If they take our work, they take our wind. Let them have neither." Weeks passed. The windmill stood silent. Its blades hung broken, its name faded on the stone base. Travelers on the western road began to call it the Dead Mill. The townspeople avoided it, yet spoke of it constantly, of the woman who burned her own fortune, of the mill that turned for no one. William Ellis was buried with the other millers of the county. His grave bore a simple inscription, "The wind stopped here." And still, no one knew why Martha Ellis had returned to the mill that night, or what she had meant by cleansing the debt. The answer, when it came, would reveal far more than the town expected. About the mill, the man, and the quiet resolve of the woman who stood against them both. The investigation into the death of William Ellis began 3 days after his burial. Sheriff Caldwell reopened the case not because of new witnesses, but because of doubt. The evidence from the site did not match the conclusion on the report. The clean cut on the brake rod, the absence of any forced movement in the gears, and the presence of an unusual residue on the lower beam all pointed away from an accident. Yet there was nothing to suggest the work of another person. No signs of intrusion, no struggle, no footprints save for William's own. Caldwell returned to the mill with his deputy and the county coroner. The building was nearly empty now, stripped of usable parts by the bank that had taken ownership. The ground beneath the structure was discolored, marked by the chemicals Martha Ellis had used to destroy the machinery. The coroner took a sample of the residue and noted the metallic odor, consistent with acid used in grain preservation. It was likely drawn from the agricultural supply depot 2 miles from town. The sheriff recorded the details and requested confirmation from the depot manager, who confirmed that Martha Ellis had purchased 2 barrels of the substance the day before the fire. That record alone might have been enough to charge her with property destruction. But Caldwell hesitated. He had known William Ellis for years, had bought flour from him each harvest season, and had never heard of trouble between the couple. The town's pastor described their home as quiet and sober. There were no debts of vice, no liquor, no gambling, no trouble with neighbors. Only the banknote and the loss of the mill. The sheriff's next step was to study the financial records. He rode into Lincoln and met with the manager of the county bank. The documents confirmed that William Ellis had signed over full ownership of the mill on May 15th, 2 days before his death. The sale had been part of a foreclosure process. He had fallen behind on payments for nearly a year. The mill's grain supply had dwindled after a poor harvest season, and he had borrowed money against the coming yield. When that yield failed, the bank claimed the property. William had signed the transfer quietly, without his wife's knowledge. The signature was his, verified by the notary. Caldwell noted that Martha's name appeared nowhere in the contract. By law, she had no right to the mill. The sheriff began to suspect that her act of destruction had been a response to this discovery, that she had learned of the transfer only after her husband's death. Still, it did not explain the manner of his death, nor the evidence suggesting tampering with the brake mechanism. The coroner's report gave little more. The fatal injury had occurred instantly. The body showed no defensive wounds, no bruises, no cuts apart from the impact itself. The coroner wrote, "The deceased was struck from above by a falling component of the windmill structure." The brake in the lever was the only unexplained feature. No one could determine when or how it had been cut. In the following week, the sheriff reviewed statements from townsfolk. Most offered nothing of substance. Neighbors recalling William's last days, workers who had seen him delivering grain, a passing trader who remembered buying flour from him near the end of April. All described him as tired, overworked, but calm. None spoke of argument or fear. What they did mention was silence. How William had spoken less in recent weeks, how he seemed preoccupied with numbers, often standing outside the mill at dusk, watching the blades turn without motion. Caldwell wrote that detail into his report. It struck him that silence was the one thing the mill had never known. For decades, its creak and hum had been part of the sound of the plains. Now it stood dead still, the blades frozen against the sky. By early June, the county officials concluded that the death remained accidental. No formal charges were filed against Martha Ellis, though the bank petitioned for compensation for the loss of the property. The sheriff recommended leniency, arguing that the act had been driven by emotional collapse following personal tragedy. The court accepted this recommendation and released her from custody on the condition that she remain within county limits. Yet Caldwell continued to keep notes. Something about the sequence of events did not align. The cut in the brake lever, the purchase of acid before the night of the fire, and the tone of her few recorded remarks suggested intent, though not necessarily guilt. He wrote privately, "She knew what she was doing, but she did not hide it. She did not deny or conceal. She acted as if her purpose was finished." By midsummer, Martha Ellis had withdrawn completely from public life. She lived in a rented farmhouse on the edge of the county line, supported by occasional sewing work. Her children remained with relatives. No one in town saw her except once, in late August, walking along the old road toward the ruins of the mill. The bank had begun dismantling the structure for salvage, and by then only the base and a single standing beam remained. Workers said she watched for several minutes, then left without speaking. They noted that she carried nothing with her. In September, the sheriff filed his final notes on the case. The last entry read, "No further evidence discovered. Cause of death remains undetermined. The mill is no longer standing." That was the official end of the matter. But unofficially, the story lingered. Farmers along the western edge of the county continued to speak of the woman who had killed her own mill. It became a local caution, repeated to younger men taking out loans, a warning against debt, pride, and machinery that outlasts its owners. The phrase Ellis Wind entered speech as shorthand for ill fortune, a venture doomed before it began. The sheriff retired 2 years later. His notes passed to the county archives where they remained for decades, yellowed and incomplete. The acid burns on the soil faded with time. The land was plowed over and planted with barley. Only the stone foundation of the mill remained, buried under grass and dust. In later years, historians searching through county records would find the case cited briefly in legal documents about property and inheritance. None mentioned the details of the death, the cut liver, or the strange final words of the widow. Those existed only in Caldwell's notebook, in a single line written between larger paragraphs. She did not mourn him as a wife mourns. She mourned the wind that no longer turned. That single observation preserved what little truth remained. The death itself was never fully explained. The motive never confirmed. The investigation had revealed a structure of ownership and debt, but not of human intent. What survived was the record of a silence, the stillness of a machine that had once given motion to a man's life, and the decision of a woman to bring that motion to an end. In the years that followed, Lincoln County changed. The railroad expanded, mills became mechanical, and the old wind-driven structures disappeared from the landscape. By 1915, none remained. Only those who had lived through that spring remembered the sound of the Ellis mill turning, and the day it stopped. For most, the story faded into rumor. But among the few who had known the family, it endured as something heavier than gossip. It was not the tragedy of one death or one act of destruction. It was the end of a way of life, the closing of a season when people believed the wind itself could be owned, and that labor alone could hold back the weight of loss. In that sense, the investigation had solved nothing. It had only recorded what the people of Lincoln already knew, that the things we build are never ours for long, and when they fall silent, we are left to measure what remains. By the winter of 1908, nearly 6 months after the death of William Ellis, the case had faded from public discussion. The county moved on to other matters: a grain shortage, a new rail line proposal, and the annual tax disputes that consumed the courthouse each December. The Ellis property had been cleared, sold at auction to a family from Iowa, and the remnants of the old windmill hauled away for scrap. Officially, nothing remained of it but a ledger entry and a cause of death marked accidental mechanical failure. However, in January of the following year, a clerk sorting through the bank's foreclosure archives uncovered an error. Among the papers documenting the Ellis estate was a letter, unsigned and undelivered, addressed to the bank itself. It had been folded into one of the debt files, likely by mistake. The handwriting was precise, deliberate, and familiar to those who had seen Martha Ellis's signature. The letter began with a statement of repayment, not of money, but of obligation. It described a private agreement between William Ellis and the County Millwrights Association, formed years earlier when he purchased the mill from its previous owner. According to the letter, William had taken not only the structure, but the responsibility for maintaining the surrounding water line that fed several smaller farms. The mill's wheel, though primarily wind-driven, was a part of that system. Over time, the water channel had become clogged with silt, and the repairs, never completed, had been passed from one owner to the next. The letter claimed that William had promised to restore the water line by spring of 1908 and had borrowed money from the association to do so. That money, separate from his bank debt, was never repaid. The text did not request mercy or forgiveness. It stated plainly, "If the wind fails, then the fault is mine, and the burden shall not pass to others." This document altered the timeline entirely. The sheriff, though retired, was contacted and asked to review the finding. He visited the bank in February 1909, now older and half forgotten by the town, and spent several hours rereading his old notes. The discovery suggested motive, but not the one people had assumed. If the promise described in the letter was real, William Ellis' death may have been a consequence of his own intent to end the chain of debt by ending the machine itself. The sheriff compared dates. The brake lever had been cut cleanly by hand before the fall. The timing matched the morning of his death. It was possible, though not provable, that William had cut it himself to stop the mill permanently. The mechanism would have failed the next time the wind turned strong, causing the upper structure to collapse. He would have known this. Caldwell's new notes, written in his own hand that spring, suggested that the act was deliberate, a form of closure rather than misfortune. William Ellis, knowing the mill was lost to the bank and unable to repay his private debt, had chosen to destroy the very thing that carried that obligation. But something had gone wrong. The machinery had failed earlier than intended, and he was caught in its collapse. If that was true, Martha's later actions took on a different meaning. Her use of acid, her quiet remark about cleansing the debt, and her destruction of what remained were not expressions of madness, but of continuation. She had finished what her husband began. The evidence fit with the logic of the letter, though no one could prove she had read it. In the sheriff's words, she completed the work. He broke the wind. She stopped it from ever turning again. The county authorities dismissed the interpretation as conjecture. They had little interest in reopening an old case, especially one involving a closed foreclosure and a dead man. Still, the document was filed into the official record, where it remained as a supplementary note to the estate. Few ever read it. In the years that followed, the Ellis name disappeared from Lincoln County rolls. The children, once returned from their relatives, moved east to Kansas by 1911. Martha herself was last recorded in 1913, listed as a domestic worker in a census form filled out in Hastings. No property, no land, no dependents. After that, no trace of her appears in any record. The sheriff's notebook, found decades later in a family attic, offered the only narrative that survived. His entries, written between March and June 1909, formed a quiet chronology of observation and reflection. They were not official documents, but they preserved the tone of a man trying to understand what the system of law could not describe. He wrote, "The law accounts for ownership, not meaning. It records the thing, not the reason. A woman may burn a mill, and it will note only the value of timber and stone lost. But the reason for fire is not part of property." That line would later be quoted by a historian reviewing the case in 1946. To her, the Ellis story was a study in rural economics, a footnote in the transformation of wind-powered mills to steam and mechanical systems. But for those who had known the sheriff, it was more than that. It was about the weight of promises that could not be measured in money or land. By 1915, the Ellis property had become an ordinary field. A new barn stood where the windmill once rose, and no one living on the land knew its past. The new owners found fragments of corroded metal when plowing, but they were discarded without interest. Only the foundation stone remained, half buried in earth. Over time, the story took on a strange endurance. People no longer spoke of death or accident, but of the wind that once failed to turn. Farmers told it to their sons not as tragedy, but as lesson, that the tools which serve a man may one day betray him, or worse, bind him. In the state archives, where the sheriff's personal notes were later transferred, a final page contained one last observation, written in fading ink. It read, "Her act was not revenge. It was restoration. The wind owed them nothing, and she gave it back." That was the last written word on the matter. By then, no one in Lincoln County remembered the sound of the Ellis Mill. No one spoke the name aloud. But every now and then, when the wind rose across the plains and moved through the dry grass, those who still farmed near the old road said the air carried a hollow note, one that came and went like a breath caught between motion and stillness. Whether truth or coincidence, it was all that remained of the wind that had once turned for William and Martha Ellis. By the 1930s, Lincoln County no longer resembled the place where the Ellis Mill once stood. The fields that had once echoed with the creak of wooden sails were now divided by barbed wire, fenced into rectangles of industrial farmland. Diesel tractors replaced horses. The rhythm of work no longer depended on wind or weather, but on engines and schedules. The progress was visible, measurable, and entirely indifferent to what it replaced. In 1934, the county courthouse underwent renovation. The basement, long neglected, dark, and damp, was emptied of decades of unprocessed records. Molded ledgers, unopened envelopes, and broken boxes were brought upstairs for cleaning. The county clerk, a young man named Henry Paulson, was tasked with restoring order. It was his first job out of college, a temporary position to supplement the staff during the Great Depression. Paulson worked alone most days. He wore gloves, used a kerosene lamp for light, and moved through the stacks with quiet precision. The boxes had no consistent labeling system. Many were marked only with single letters or half-faded names. His task was not to interpret, but to categorize. Death, property, foreclosure, domestic. He was told to keep the process simple, and so he did. Among the stacks, one box caught his attention. It was smaller than the others, sealed with wax and labeled faintly in graphite. Misktu Property Claims, 1908-1911. Inside were fragments, coroner's notes, land transfers, a sheriff's letter, and a brittle photograph of a structure resembling a windmill. On the back of the photograph, a handwritten line read, "Ellis Mill, prior to collapse." Paulson read the report. The tone was detached, written in the formal language of rural law enforcement. Subject, deceased. Cause of death, mechanical failure. Beneath, in smaller print, a note. Lever cleanly severed. Possible tool involvement. It was signed, W. Caldwell, Sheriff. Another document referenced a woman, Mrs. M. Ellis, spouse, charged temporarily with destruction of property. The case, however, had been dismissed due to mental distress, non-criminal motive. There were no further proceedings. Paulson recorded the facts, then placed the folder in a separate pile marked "To Retain." He made no moral judgment. His job was the preservation of sequence, not meaning. 2 weeks later, while cross-referencing the documents, he found an envelope addressed to the Lincoln County Bank, Receivership Department. Inside was a notice of foreclosure dated May 15, 1908, 2 days before the mill accident. The property had been legally seized, debts forgiven, ownership transferred. The man's death, therefore, had occurred not on his land, but on property owned by the bank. Paulson noted this coincidence in his ledger with one line of pencil. Temporal overlap between foreclosure and fatal incident. Relevance uncertain. That was all. He closed the box and moved on. But something about the Ellis name lingered. The handwriting, the signatures, the orderly sequence of events. It all seemed unnaturally complete for such an old rural file. Most early 1900s records were chaotic, stained or missing pages. This one was almost perfect, as if someone had ensured its survival. In 1936, Paulson compiled his index report. The Ellis case appeared as entry Got 1921 B. Windmill collapse 1908, fatality W. Ellis, spouse M. Ellis, property damaged, cause mechanical, subsequent action none. He submitted it to the county archive, which then transferred it to the State Historical Bureau in Lincoln. There, it was reclassified as Industrial Transition Incident. The case no longer belonged to the family or the town. It belonged to a system that converted human loss into administrative fact. By 1942, a historian employed by the Bureau referenced the Ellis file in a report on agricultural modernization. He described it as an isolated case illustrating the instability of pre-mechanized labor. There was no mention of the woman, no hint of intent, only process and consequence. Through the 1950s, the Ellis name surfaced periodically in academic references. A footnote in one article about economic failure, another about early rural protest. The tragedy became abstraction. When Paulson revisited the state archives in 1958, 24 years after finding the file, he discovered it had been condensed to microfilm. The documents he once held were now small, flat images inside a labeled reel. Reel 47B, Windmill Incident, Lincoln County. The paper had been discarded. The scent of mildew, the weight of the ink, the texture of time, all replaced by light on glass. He was told this was progress, preservation through reduction. In his retirement notes, Paulson later wrote privately, "We call it record keeping, but what we preserve are only the boundaries, dates, names, ownership. Everything else is vapor. The woman's silence, the reason for her act, all gone." After his death in 1961, his papers were donated to the University of Nebraska. His personal remarks about the Ellis file resurfaced decades later, cited by archivists as early evidence of archival consciousness. The file itself, however, remained untouched. During the 1970s digitization efforts, the Ellis materials were copied again, this time into early computer databanks. The format changed, but the wording stayed the same. Each transformation removed more of the original context until all that remained was a data structure. Name, Ellis, Martha, spouse, date, May 1908, event, windmill collapse, classification, property destruction, domestic. That was the record, the totality of a life condensed to a pattern of fields. In 1983, a revision of Nebraska's historical index removed cross-references deemed redundant. The Ellis file lost its connection to William Ellis, who now appeared separately under industrial fatalities. From that point on, the database treated them as unrelated. By 1995, even that system had been replaced. The digital archive converted to a federal database, where early records were grouped under the category Historical Agricultural Events. The original microfilm was stored in an unmarked box, its label handwritten by an unknown clerk. The story had ceased to exist in any form that resembled memory. Yet survival in archives does not depend on remembrance. It depends on process. In 2001, a historian studying foreclosure patterns cited the Ellis entry again, calling it an early example of emotional reaction to economic displacement. There was no mention of the acid, the night at the mill, or the phrase Martha had spoken, cleansing the debt. Those elements no longer appeared in any official record. They existed only in the margins of a 1908 sheriff's note, which was never scanned. The phrase survived only by chance, typed once in an early 20th century newspaper index, now nearly illegible. It was cataloged not as testimony but as local color. By 2010, the digital archive had become fully searchable. The Ellis entry still appeared, buried under hundreds of similar cases. It read, Ellis, Martha, 1908, Lincoln County. Domestic incident resulting in destruction of property. Cause, emotional distress. Nothing more. The completeness of the record gave it authority. But what it contained was absence. The gradual erasure of intent, of language, of consequence. In a century of preservation, the event had been made permanent by being emptied of meaning. And yet, in the quiet rhythm of digital maintenance, the file continued to live. Each update copied it forward. New systems, new storage, new formats. Servers replaced drawers, but the content endured. Unchanged, misunderstood, eternal. For those who worked in the archive, the file was simply one among thousands. But for those who still touched paper, the historians who read beyond metadata, it was something else. A symbol of how truth dissolves in preservation. In the margins of one archivist's 2019 logbook, beside the Ellis entry, there appeared a faint handwritten note. Record survives without reason. Windmill destroyed, data remains. It was unsigned, and so the file persists, stored in servers cooled by industrial fans, replicated across systems that have never heard of the place where the wind once turned. No one speaks her name, but the name still exists, perfectly indexed, eternally retrievable. In its silence, the archive keeps faith with itself. It does not question, it only remembers the act of remembering. The Ellis case, once about loss, has become about permanence. The endurance of a record stripped of the life that produced it. What began with motion and breath has become a pattern of storage. That is how history survives now. Not through memory or meaning, but through the persistence of the system that cannot forget what it no longer understands.